So once we create the basic integration app by selecting the input and output apps or databases, we need to actually configure each of those. So firstly, we need to configure the actual input connector. So in this case, we need to configure our Wufoo connector. And to do that, we just simply press the connector itself. Now the first thing you'll notice when configuring any of these connectors, whether they're input or output connectors, is you will be asked to add some connection information or to get at the actual service or connect to the actual service or database in question. So in the case of Wufoo, so firstly you just need to press the little plus button here, but in the case of Wufoo you need to provide an account name and an API key. So I have one already. Called Foxweave, and I'll paste in the API key, but you get those typically from the actual service itself, or if you have a database you'll need to know what the connection parameter information for that is. So you just input it there. Once you've done that once for a particular app or database, you shouldn't need to do it again, or at least if you might need to modify it, but you shouldn't need to actually create it again. You can reuse them. Okay, so in the case of Wufoo, once I put in that connection information for Wufoo, it'll actually go out and get a list of forms from Wufoo. Okay, so that's my basic configuration done for the Wufoo connector, and this is the same basic principle across all connectors, that you'll need to provide or select a connection set and then specify some form of trigger to actually trigger the synchronizations on that integration. So in this case we are selecting a Wufoo form. So whenever a new Wufoo form gets when data gets put on the Wufoo form, Wufoo will actually post using webhooks will post to our integration. So that's the basic configuration for Wufoo. Now all input connectors also support the idea of input data filters. So you just click on this tab here, and what they are simply just a set of filtering rules, the same as with your email. Okay, so in the case of this Wufoo form, maybe we might want to only sync form submissions where the email address does not end with cloudbees.com, for example. So we can say email not ends with, and then put in whatever we want. So in this case, cloudbees.com. So that's one example of how you'd use the filtering rules. Now in the case of some services or databases, for example, where you only want to sync based on the last synchronization. So basically where every time you do a sync, you don't want to sync previous data that you've done. Okay, so what you can do in that situation is maybe use a date field or an ID field in the actual data set coming across. So using in the case of this Wufoo one here, maybe it's a entry ID is where the entry, you only want to sync where the entry ID is greater than the last sync value. That's one example. In a database, it might be an incrementing ID or something that you don't want to sync. You only want to sync where that's greater than. Now, where you want to sync when you're synchronizing change data, that would be different again. But that's an example of how you would use filters there, and that's the basic points in terms of configuring an input connector.